Parlez-vous français, fools? C'est la Industry Focus. Hey fools, Taylor Muckerman here with Tyler Crow. We're talking about the Paris Climate Change Conference and some impacts that it might have on the overall energy sector, and also, what companies in general are doing to address climate change and the use of fossil fuels. Tyler, you've been following the conference a little bit. What are your thoughts so far, as it's only a couple days old?
Well, one of the things that I think maybe people don't necessarily understand about the Paris climate talks is that a lot of the foundation for what has been going on with it has been going on for years. If we remember a couple of years ago, China and U.S. had a joint climate talk, and they both made pledges on reducing carbon emissions. And that's basically the framework for what this entire thing is. It's basically a lot of countries that have made these voluntary pledges to reduce carbon emissions, and they've brought them to this conference. And now the conference is more or less along the lines of, how do we enforce this? And for countries that are emerging market countries, maybe countries that are struggling a little bit more to finance kind of the shift, how can we help them, afford it? And those have been kind of the sticking points and what has been the important stuff here, rather than the how are we going to cut carbon emissions, because a lot of that framework has already been brought to the table.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I've seen, you look at a lot of the countries that produce fossil fuels, like Saudi Arabia is fighting back on this a little bit, but then you have island nations that are like, no, please, dear God, support climate change, or otherwise we're going to be drowning in the next 100 years. And one of those emerging markets that's pushed back especially has been Brazil, and I don't think this should be any surprise given their reliance on mining and the oil and gas sector for their entire economy.
Yeah, we've seen Brazil push back a little bit, and a lot of the countries, if we look at energy consumption, you have the United States, the EU, I guess you could say developed, mature markets, and if you look at total consumption, it's been relatively flat or even declining over the past 10 to 15 years. I think one of the bigger topics to handle isn't going to be places like the EU and the US who have, set some targets. Maybe they're not the most ambitious, but they're on the right path, but rather the really large emerging economies, countries like India, countries like China, that still have a lot of people who, on a GDP per capita, it's still pretty low. Average, household incomes aren't great. And to increase those and bring them up to a higher standard of living that they want to achieve, it requires an immense amount of energy. And how to solve that, Brazil is another one just like that. How are we going to be able to deliver the energy that these people need while at the same time meeting these carbon targets? It's going to be a really interesting thing to figure out.
Yeah, you'd have to imagine there would have to be some kind of contribution on the part of developed nations to help fund that, as you mentioned earlier, people not having the money to do so. Well, let's jump into one of the ways that the global carbon emissions levels could be reduced over the long term, and that's a transition that's underway in some small part, and that's to electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles as kind of the segue to electric vehicles. We've seen some adoption around the world. I think some numbers since 2009 to the end of last year, to the middle of this year. There's over 1 million EVs sold worldwide now, so there's been some rapid adoption. The million number doesn't really jump off the page when you think of total vehicles around the world, but from 0 to 1 million in just 6 years is pretty impressive. What are your thoughts on the changing industry dynamics in terms of electric vehicles, not just for consumers, but also for industry as well?
Yeah, I find it really interesting. I think there's a I guess you could call it the low-hanging fruit, and then the more challenging things that we can achieve here. When we think of conversion over to alternative energy, our immediate thoughts are solar and wind, which are ways of producing electricity. And so the ability to kind of disrupt and transform the electric market, moving away from coal, moving away from, to a lesser degree, natural gas, is an easier transition. But one of the biggest challenges, of course, is going to be how do we get transportation? And like you said, electric vehicles have been a good way of doing it, and we've seen companies like Tesla Motors that have really been driving this as of late. You know, not in the sense of actual total vehicles sold, but more along the lines of driving the technology that is helping to enable.
And the headlines as well. So
yeah,
it's getting the word out.
Yeah, certainly the media attention around Tesla Motors certainly helps things an awful lot. But I think there's a big question, like that harder stuff that's going to be able to convert, you know, commuting cars, light-duty vehicles, like what we've seen with like the Nissan Leaf or Tesla. There are easier fixes because the demands of power are not as great. I think one of the hard things that people don't really think about is heavier duty jobs. You know, we're thinking about trucking, construction equipment. These are very, very large consumers of fossil fuels, especially in the oil space. And are we going to be able to develop, or where is the technology that's going to come that we can actually replace these? Because right now, where electric vehicles are right now, it seems like it's a very, very long ways off until we can actually replace these. And the question is natural gas an adequate change here? You know, companies like Clean Energy Fuels, Westport Innovations, they've been trying to push this move towards natural gas for heavier duty vehicles as an option, and obviously natural gas is less pollutive than oil. And the question is this going to be an acceptable change over the long term to help meet those needs?
Yeah, and you see some hybrid models out there in terms of like earth moving equipment, but nothing on a grand scale. And as you mentioned, trucking is a huge user of fossil fuels, and there really hasn't been any momentum that I'm aware of in terms of fully electric semi-trucks or locomotives or anything along those lines. So you certainly see some adoption into liquefied natural gas, but that's still a fossil fuel at its origin. So we're not completely removing ourselves from that. And even the earth-moving vehicles that I'm talking about, a couple from Caterpillar, Komatsu, and Deere, they are still hybrid. So they're using a diesel engine as a generator to produce electricity for the drivetrain and such. So still using fossil fuels. I think you're right. The industrial side of our transportation sector, and I think that's going to be the slow burn in terms of adoption. And you're talking about just so much power needed to disrupt that industry in terms of engine size and kilowatts needed, that these batteries are just going to have to improve significantly to be able to tow and haul tons and tons of material. Moving on, we've got another segment we'd like to talk about, and that is moving towards cleaner energy. Big energy companies, in terms of oil and gas companies, could get caught off guard. I saw an article on Financial Times questioning whether some of these big energy companies are the Kodaks of the next generation in terms of change kind of creeping up on them until it's too late to really counteract or adopt change themselves. And Tyler, you emailed me this morning an idea and a company that you had in mind that might be getting a step ahead in regards to kind of not changing their business model completely, but at least creating new business lines that do involve green energy.
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges, you get a lot of investors or, media people asking the question, why can't oil companies, big oil companies like the Exxon Mobils and Chevrons of the world that generate tons and tons of cash, how come they aren't, getting more into the alternative energy space? And what they do now seems more like a greenwashing. It's like, oh, we're doing this, but it's a very token amount of investment compared to what they do. And one of the big reasons is they don't really have a strategic advantage when it comes into moving into alternative energy. There are a bunch of petroleum engineers, geologists, things like that. These guys don't really know voltaics. Excuse me. Ooh, bad language today. They don't have that knowledge and that industry expertise or any sort of strategic advantage where a company like a SunPower or First Solar is going to, kind of eat their lunch if they were to get into this space. However, if there is one thing that they could do and kind of looking at the possibilities that big oil could get into, I think one realm that they could use as a transition into alternative energy is actually offshore wind. It's a highly there's a lot of potential when it comes to offshore wind, but what we've seen with projects as of late is they all come in wildly over budget. They take much longer to develop, which has been one of the big issues with so many energy projects as of late. So if you look at big oil companies, one of the things that they have been very, very good at over the past 10, 20, even 30 years is building out infrastructure and facilities in offshore environments. And it is very possible that they could use the strategic advantage that they have in that developing and constructing infrastructure in the offshore realm to build offshore wind facilities. And we're actually starting to see one company kind of test the waters with this, and that's Statoil. They are the Norwegian national oil company, kind of a hybrid publicly traded company, national oil company. And they've been building floating offshore wind facilities off the coast of Norway. They've been relatively small, almost you could say like test facilities, almost even using them to power offshore oil rigs. So not exactly, the biggest transition to alternative energy, but it shows a way forward that actually gives them something they can bring to the table. Because as long as the ExxonMobil, Chevrons, Statoils of the world don't really have something to bring to the table, I don't really see them making any significant movements anytime soon.
And you mentioned Statoil, and then you think of another European company, Total. I believe they're heavily invested in SunPower. Is that correct? So
yeah, I think they own like 60% of all shares outstanding in SunPower. So,
yeah, and that goes back to what you were talking about earlier about these chemical and petrochemical engineers. Maybe not necessarily having the photovoltaic experience or the wind power turbine experience. So why not go out there and maybe dump some cash into a company that's already got globs and globs of experience in those different industries? And so you've got two European big energy companies kind of making some movement towards these renewable resources. And you look at Exxon a few years ago, completely selling out of their biofuels. Kind of foray into biofuels. It was a small movement, but they sold out of it. And BP, another European company, they've kind of canceled most of their renewable projects. So perhaps these companies with so much cash on their balance sheet, perhaps rather than trying to figure it out themselves, maybe you'll see some unexpected acquisitions over the next 5 to 10 years in the renewable energy space, rather than trying to recreate the wheel themselves. Because kind of go back to Tesla talking about some of these bigger auto manufacturers not necessarily being able to keep up on the EV front because they have these engineers that aren't data scientists and technology experts. So Tesla's way ahead of the game. They're hiring a completely different group of individuals compared to the Fords and General Motors of the world. So even those big auto companies are going to have to make that transition in employment as well. So maybe you'll see some acquisitions there. And I think that it's such a dramatic shift on both fronts that acquisitions kind of make the most sense.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you do have to give credit to a company like the big oil companies is, for the most part, they are very, very good capital allocators, and they are very, very good, actually, long-term investors. If you look at some of the investments they have to make for oil and gas projects, it's 10 to 15-year investments. I think a great example is like Gorgon LNG project in Australia. Maybe not the best budgeted one. They've gone over budget.
You're being too nice.
But this is something this was an offshore gas find that they found back in the early 90s and have had the kind of vision and foresight to develop this over a 25-year process. And, if these companies were to start to see, returns on solar energy, on alternative energy, or any other form that we can find, if they can start to see attractive returns on those levels, it would not be surprised if they started to make that transition, simply because they can look at it from a capital allocation standpoint and say, this is the best way to deploy our capital.
Makes a ton of sense. Well, fools, I think that about wraps up the show, unless, Tyler, you've got anything that you wanted to kind of get off your chest.
No, I think I'm going to be watching Paris, see what happens for the rest of the time. Other than that, I think everybody needs to enjoy the holidays coming up and kind of coming down from Thanksgiving.
Right on. Yeah, I think that the implications of these Paris talks aren't going to be felt immediately, but certainly some long-term investing themes that people can take to heart. If you have 5 to 10 years or longer to leave your money in the market, you could take some smaller bets on progress and change in the renewable energy sector.